Good morning, everyone. My name, as you've just heard, is Thomas Bartscherer. I teach here at Bard College, and I'm a senior fellow at the Arendt Center. Roger asked me to let you know that we're starting now at 17 minutes after 11, so we'll start the next session at 17 minutes after 12, and we'll continue on that schedule until we get to lunch. I'd first like to thank everyone from the Arendt Center, particularly Tina and Jana and Hillary and Phil for their excellent work. In the, yes? In the early days of these conferences, they had a kind of DIY feeling to them, sort of like Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney, let's put on a show. And things have changed over the years. Now we have these monitors, and we have live stream, and we even have flowers out. But what has remained the same is a kind of intellectual vitality and genuine collegiality. These events have always been provocative but never polemical, and they are never fashionable but always timely, and that's thanks to the imagination of Roger Berkowitz. So I'd like to thank you too, Roger. Our next speaker, Seyla Benhabib, is uniquely well suited to participate in a conference on cosmopolitanism which is hosted by the Hannah Arendt Center, and I'll say why in a moment, but first I'll tell you that Professor Benhabib's work will be well known to many of you here, many of you watching online. I'm sure she has written on a wide range of topics in political science, philosophy, and law, as evidenced in her many highly regarded books and articles. She taught for about 20 years at Yale University, prior to that at Harvard and the New School for Social Research. She has held many distinguished fellowships and lectureships in her fields. Put simply, Seyla Benhabib is one of the most influential and respected political theorists of our time. But when I say that she's uniquely well suited to be at this conference, I have in mind particularly her work on Hannah Arendt and on cosmopolitanism. If you were to ask the first few random Arendtians you meet on the street, which actually happens here at Bard, to name the most influential books on Arendt written in the past 20 years, I suspect that most, if not all of them, on their lists would include Professor Benhabib's 2003 book, The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt. And in the time since then, Professor Benhabib has also profoundly shaped the vibrant and often contentious scholarly debates over cosmopolitanism, not only with her landmark 2006 book titled Another Cosmopolitanism, but also with her commitment, and this is a very Arendtian commitment, to perpetually rethinking that concept in writing and lectures in the years since then. Last month, Professor Benhabib was awarded the prestigious Adorno Prize given by the city of Frankfurt, Germany. She also, by the way, has been awarded the Ernst Bloch Prize, the Leopold Lucas Prize, the Meister Eckhart Prize, basically any prize with a name, she's just sort of collecting them. In her acceptance speech for the Adorno Prize, which was delivered in German, but you can read it in German if you do, but you can also read it in English on the Boston Review website. In her speech, Professor Benhabib makes reference to Immanuel Kant's idea of enlarged mentality. She writes, and I quote, "Enlarged thought, mentality or thought, is not empathy, for it does not mean feeling the standpoint of the other or even accepting and agreeing with it. But it does mean making present to oneself the perspective of others involved, and it means asking whether I could woo for their consent. Enlarged thought displays the qualities of judgment necessary to retrieve the plural quality of the world." It has been one of Seyla Benhabib's great achievements through her writing and teaching and through the exemplarity of her life and her work, not only to help us understand, but also to foster in her readers and her students precisely this judgment that is necessary to retrieve the plurality of the shared world. Please join me in welcoming the Eugene Meyer Professor Emerita of Political Science and Philosophy at Yale and Senior Research Fellow at Columbia, also has a long title, at Columbia Law School and at the Center for Contemporary Critical Theory at Columbia, Seyla Benhabib.
Thank you. This was a very generous introduction. I have been a friend of the Hannah Arendt Center for many years, and it's a pleasure to see the vitality and the intensity of the public conversation that the center has generated under Roger's leadership. It is absolutely unique. I myself am probably more on the dry side. I'm a political philosopher by training, and I do a lot of work now in international law, but Fintan O'Toole's brilliant speech gave me a wonderful entree to what I want to talk about this morning. He said, Hannah Arendt's generation bequeathed to us something, a world of institutions, also a world of institutions that emerge, I would say, out of a cosmopolitan imagination. So, thank you again, and with that, let me begin. The intense interest in cosmopolitanism in the social and political sciences, cultural and legal studies dates back to the last 2 decades of the 20th century. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the unification of Germany, and the extension of the European Union to East and Central European countries, the Kantian ideal of uniting diverse countries under the rule of law, respect for human rights, and the free movement of peoples, goods, and services across borders, as it's stated in the mission of the European Union Common Market then, seem to come alive. Today, it is tempting to see such universalism and cosmopolitanism as wholly passé and grossly inadequate. Many post-colonial and decolonial thinkers have argued that a provincialized European identity must require an awareness that its universalism derives not from an unchangeable normative core, but stands in need of constant renewal from the margins, a point with which I agree. In addition to the post-colonial critiques of cosmopolitanism, there are 2 other strands which are based on a misunderstanding of this concept and tradition, and in particular of the Kantianism from which it stems. The first line of critique confuses globalist free market neoliberalism with cosmopolitanism. You will often find references in the literature by sociologists to cosmopolitanism. This is a point of view developed by both right and left-wing populists who attack global cosmopolitan elites and take pleasure in reducing cosmopolitanism to the ideology of frequent flying jet setters. So this attack on cosmopolitan elites is a common point of reference in both left and right-wing populism, and I think, again, as I will argue, it is based on a grave misunderstanding of cosmopolitanism. The second strand of criticism, I think, is an anxiety voiced in this conference by the use of the term tribalism. Dr. Botstein gave a brilliant introduction to the many valences of this term, Stamm, stammförmig, etc., in German. But I want to raise or reformulate the question in the following terms. Does cosmopolitanism deny the importance of ethical bonds and affinities or associational obligations which result from our being embedded or situated in communities of language, ethnicity, religion, and history. So the question also has a moral, ethical dimension about affiliations and associational obligations to communities. My own answer, again, is that no, cosmopolitanism does not involve a denial of such obligations and affiliations, but it does require that these obligations and affiliations be subject or be considered in the light of universalist moral principles. It requires reflexivity. Historically, some ancient and Greek cosmopolitans, some ancient Greek and Roman cosmopolitans, such as, for example, Diogenes the Cynic, denied the pull of such special obligations upon us. In view of the realities of the ancient world, in which not to be a member of a polis and to accept its ethos was the equivalent of being a god or a beast, as Aristotle famously formulated it, it is understandable that those who wish to distance themselves from the polis and the practice of slavery would also deny the value of these primordial attachments upon us. But as Martha Nussbaum expresses it in her excellent study of this tradition, quote, just as we can defend the intrinsic and motivational importance of ties to family and friends without denying that we owe something to all our fellow citizens, we can also defend, she says, a type of patriotism that builds ties of recognition and concern with people outside our national borders. I'm less sanguine than Nussbaum is about the term patriotism. I want a more precise narrative and definition of what kind of patriotism, whose patriotism, and how we can reconcile it with ties of recognition and concern beyond our borders. But I accept Nussbaum's insight that we need to develop a moral psychology that reconciles particularistic attachments with universalizing circles of sympathy, or what Arendt called, again borrowing from Kant, enlarged mentality, die erweiterte Denkungsart. In contemporary societies, the question is whether any ethical bonds and obligations resulting from these elective and non-elective affinities and affiliations can survive the dissolving asset forces of the market and of consumer and social media cultures. I believe this is part of the anxiety lurking behind the term cosmopolitanism, tribalism. It is an anxiety that I understand, but which I believe can be situated in a Kantian cosmopolitan tradition, which focuses also on institutions without precluding these affiliations and associations. So, in true Germanic fashion, I'm going to begin with a brief excursus into Kant's work. And then I want to turn to Hannah Arendt's essay on Karl Jaspers called Karl Jaspers, Citizen of the World. Arendt had delivered the Laudatio for Jaspers when he received the Peace Prize of the German book trade in 1958 after the publication of his book, The Atom Bomb and the Future of Mankind. Arendt, in this essay, embraces much in the Kantian cosmopolitan tradition, as well as voicing some skepticism about its claims upon us. But this, I will argue, by no means leads her to endorse tribalism and reject universalism. So let me give you now a brief excursus into Kantian cosmopolitanism, which was not mentioned by Dr. Botstein, but is very much part of the tradition that he discussed. The seminal work of Kantian cosmopolitanism is an 1795 essay called Towards Perpetual Peace, a Philosophical Sketch zum ewigen Frieden, which Kant wrote after the conclusion of the revolutionary wars between France and Prussia. Now, this essay begins with a well-known joke, and since there are very few jokes in the history of philosophy, I'm going to read this joke to you. Kant writes, "We can leave open the question whether this satirical caption and what he means to the picture of a graveyard, which was painted on the sign of a Dutch innkeeper." So Kant is referring to a picture of a graveyard below which is the satirical caption, "Zum ewigen Frieden," which in German is what one puts on graveyards, which means eternal peace, right? And Kant says, well, whether this notion of eternal peace applies to human beings in general, or specifically to the heads of state, who can never get enough of war, or even just to philosophers who dream the sweet dream of perpetual peace, is moot. The point is that one can enjoy the sweet dream of perpetual peace, not in life, but only in death. Now, of course, Kant, who proceeds to propose preliminary and definitive articles of peace among states, is himself aware of the irony that accompanies his philosophical proposal, which he therefore names ein Entwurf, a proposal or a sketch. Yet he is not deterred from trying to make perpetual peace among nations possible. So, what are the definitive articles of perpetual peace? The first article states, "The civil constitution of every state shall be republican," in small r sense. That is, in a republic, the principles of freedom for all members of society, dependence upon a common legislation as subject, and legal equality as citizens will be respected. Such a republican constitution, claims Kant, would serve peace because if the consent of the citizens were consulted, and a republican constitution demands this, it is unlikely, he writes, that they would call upon themselves all the miseries of war. Now, this claim has subsequently become known in political science as the theorem of democratic peace, namely that democracies do not make war against each other, and as you can imagine, there's a whole literature, I see Roger laughing on this. Now, for Kant, respect for the autonomous person within a republican constitution has to be embedded in peace among nations. And this is why the second definitive article requires that international law, Völkerrecht, and I should say that the German term Recht is ambiguous in English between right and law. So Kant says Völkerrecht, we translate it in English as international law. International law shall be based on a federalism of free states. This kind of federalism is unique because it is a Pacific federation, which is different than a peace treaty. In a peace treaty, you can reserve some conditions under which the treaty may be abrogated. But in this kind of Pacific Federation treaty, the claim is to end not merely one war, but to end all wars. There's been a discussion of over 200 years whether Kant envisaged a world state or whether he meant a world republic, and how we can even conceive of this proposal. Kant himself definitely rejected the idea of a world state, calling it a soulless despotism. He was attached to the idea of our attachment to our individual republics, but nonetheless, he thought that something like a world federated republic was possible. The third proposition is what Kant calls cosmopolitan right. And this is a bit surprising. He says, cosmopolitan right shall be limited to the conditions of universal hospitality. Now, this is very puzzling. And here, what is meant by universal hospitality? By universal hospitality, he means, quote, the right of a stranger not to be treated in a hostile manner upon his arrival on the other's territory, if it can be done without causing his death. The stranger can be turned away. In the passages in which Kant defends this cosmopolitan right, he is very concerned to defend the Enlightenment notion of us trying to learn from each other, to go towards each other, while also criticizing European imperialism. There are explicit references in these passages in Perpetual Peace and the metaphysical elements of justice, where Kant definitely criticizes and repudiates the colonial practices of European states, both in seeking forced access to Japan and China and to the sugar, to the sugar colonies in particular. Needless to say, some scholars argue that Kant left the door open, but the door nonetheless for Western expansion to other continents was left open despite his equivocation. For me, what is important is that in this 1795 essay, Kant formulated a model of relations among peoples based upon respect for the equality of sovereign polities and the human rights of their citizens. With his concept of cosmopolitan right, Kant went even further than international law and envisaged a world civil society which would be governed by certain laws and norms, both in culture and in economics, and of course in our days in communication. Kant formulated the essence of a tradition which we refer to now as liberal internationalism. This tradition includes Hans Kelsen, as well as Ronald Dworkin, Harold Coe, as well as Anne-Marie Slaughter and Samantha Power. Liberal internationalists argue that it is wrong to think of sovereignty as a unilateral prerogative to be wielded against other sovereigns. Rather, states exist within regimes of sovereignty that change over time. The Westphalian model, the 1648, which is a misnomer historically, by the way, the Westphalian model of the idea of the absolute jurisdiction of a central authority over all that is living and dead on its myth is a territory, or over its territory is a myth, and if it was ever historical reality is doubtful. For liberal internationalists, sovereignty must be exercised within a system of international law, and in the post-war period was regulated by institutions such as the United Nations Charter, Universal Declarations of Human Rights, and the entire multilateral regime of human rights that has been created in the post-war period. Today, this model of international relations, the post-World War II utopia, is in a shambles. It is threatened by conflicts extending from the Ukraine to Palestine, from Sudan to Venezuela. But debunking this tradition in the name of a realism of power relations is quite different than reconstructing it. And this is the latter route which I have followed in my work in the last 2 or 3 decades. The ideal of world politics based upon mutual respect for the rule of law and for supranational international institutions such as the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court is challenged today in the name of a superpower competition, with each superpower jostling for its sphere of influence. Carl Schmitt's concept of the Lebensraum, which is the concept with which he justified the Nazi expansion, meaning, space for living, right, Lebensraum, has found new fans in Putin's Russia through the work of a philosopher who combines Hegel and Schmitt called Alexander Dugin, as well as in Xi Jinping, China. In the United States as well, liberal internationalism is in a battle for the soul of the nation, as Biden rightly puts it, against an unprincipled transactional autocracy represented by the Trump movement, in which all international relations are now understood along the model of commercial transactions. Before trying to get clearer on what we would lose by the demise of such liberal internationalism, let me turn to Hannah Arendt and Karl Jaspers. In Karl Jaspers' Citizen of the World, Arendt begins by rejecting world government and world citizenship, but she concedes to Kant's cosmopolitanism the following insight. I'm quoting, "Mankind, which for all preceding generations was no more than a concept or an ideal, has become something of an urgent reality." And she continues, "For the first time in history," remember, this is 1958, "for the first time in history, all peoples on earth have a common present. No event of any importance in the history of one country can remain a marginal accident in the history of any other. Every country has become," she says, "the almost immediate neighbor of every other country, and every man feels the shock of events which take place at the other side of the globe," end of quote. This common present does not emerge from a common past, she notes, nor does it guarantee a common future. It is technology which has united the world, and it can easily destroy it. And just think about 1958, which technology of communication are she and Jaspers really talking about? Telephones and TV. It's a completely different world technologically than ours, but they anticipate something. Whereas the technology of communication has enabled the unity of mankind, the technology of mastering the forces of the universe through the splitting of the atom, nuclear, the atom bomb, presages a destructive force which can end human life on Earth. Arendt writes, again, this negative solidarity based on the fear of global destruction has its correspondence in a less articulate, no less potent apprehension that the solidarity of mankind can be meaningful in a positive sense if it is coupled with political responsibility, end of quote. How can negative solidarity, a solidarity that is imposed on mankind through technologies of weapons of mass destruction, etc., become a sense of shared political responsibility? And here is, again, Arendt's absolute brilliance about political events and relations. She says, how is such political responsibility possible beyond political apathy, isolationist nationalism, or desperate rebellion? Okay? So there's something about the complexity of this world condition and the obligations that are expected from us that in her eyes may lead to apathy, nationalism, and desperate rebellion. But of course, this is not Arendt's last word on the matter. For her, as for Jaspers, humankind has emerged as a tangible political reality. But the philosophy of mankind, and we all know Arendt always uses, the masculine pronoun. We just have to let that rest there. The philosophy of mankind must not envisage man, she writes, as a singular subject talking to himself, but rather as human beings talking and communicating with each other. That is to say, the human condition is one of plurality, not of singularity. But this human condition does not coincide with the dignity of all human beings. It is not a sociological reality, she notes, and will probably never become one. Rather, it is the striving towards the ideal of humanity in all its plurality that paves the way towards genuine solidarity. So Arendt concludes, politically, she says, the new fragile unity brought about by technical mastery over the earth can be guaranteed only within a framework of universal mutual agreements, which eventually would lead into a world federated structure. Okay? So we find here both Hannah Arendt's republicanism and her plea for some kind of world federated structure. And as we know, there have always been tensions, creative tensions, between these ideas, some of which we are exploring in this conference. But it is important to note that already in mid-century, both Arendt and Jaspers deeply reflected on the solidarity and interdependence to which the new technologies of communication, as well as the realities of the atomic age, had given rise to. In our age of the worldwide internet, the ever-rapid movement of germs, news, fashions, and weapons across borders, the enormous netting of state economies in a world system of finance, such interdependence has achieved unimagined dimensions. Arendt was less sanguine than Jaspers in hopes for the future of a universal mankind. And she was less sanguine even that such a federation, although she thought it was the only solution for mankind, could emerge, because for her, the destruction of European Jewry, whom she called the weakest link in the chain of Europe's nations, proved how difficult it would be to construct a world of institutions and promises and commitments in the future. Nonetheless, she admired new political beginnings, and as many of you know, in her clairvoyant essays on Zionism, particularly Zionism Reconsidered, she advocated a Mediterranean unity of peoples as the solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. So to come towards a conclusion. Such global responsibility as Arendt advocates cannot be achieved by dismantling the institutions of liberal internationalism even further. Such a world, let us not make mistakes, would be one of tyrants and autocrats who now would be emboldened by the disappearance of multilateral institutions and the drying up of international law, and would see no limits to the exercise of their powers. In view of world events since the brutal Hamas attacks on Israel of October 7, 2023, and the unfolding of the genocidal war against the Palestinian people of Gaza, and I choose my words carefully, which has gone beyond any moral or political reason of Israel's right of self-defense, I have often found myself conversing with Hannah Arendt. What would she have thought? I'm sure many of you have asked this question. Would she have said, "I warned you so"? Hard to know. But of one point I'm certain. She would have been surprised, but she would not have rejected the case brought by South Africa and the Republic of Ireland against the State of Israel in front of the International Criminal Court. Perhaps she would have been sad that it had come to this for Israel and for the Jewish people. But it is the legacy of the cosmopolitan tradition that such institutions as the International Criminal Court exist, not virtually as a court of world opinion, but actually. We could all watch these impressive proceedings and educate and enlighten ourselves about the laws of war among nations and how, even under such conditions, human dignity and rights must be respected. Perpetual peace does this not, but why give up hoping and working for it? Thank you.
Is this on? Yes. Seyla, thank you so much. There's so much really I'd love to talk with you about, but my charge from our host is to keep the dialogue between us relatively short and open up to the room. And I should say that's also my desire, because I'm pretty confident that the questions that come from the room, especially from the high school students who have been asking consistently the best questions, will be better than the ones I come up with. So what I want to do is adumbrate a few things that, had we but whirled enough in time, we might talk about, and then focus on one particular question at a little more length, and then open for the room. So a few of the questions that are on my mind, one is, and this is the one I'll return to, is about the nature of our commitment or the nature or character of our commitment to cosmopolitan ideals, as you understand that. Second is about the political legitimacy. It's only the first one I'm going to ask you about, so you don't have to worry about the rest. The second, though, if I had time, would be about the political legitimacy of cosmopolitan ideals. And what I'm thinking about there particularly is potential tensions between the legitimizing power of self-governance or popular sovereignty, and the tension between that and cosmopolitan ideals that might not have the mandate of a self-governed society. There's also a question about the grounds for the rejection of a world state, which you share with Kant and Nussbaum, and it seems everybody. And I think exploring that might lead to thinking both about the nature of plurality and potentially about the limits of the political. There's also a question about your really interesting exploration of, theorization of a Kantian cosmopolitanism that embraces non-European sources. And lastly, I'm very interested in your own path, the path of your own commitment to these ideals over time, and the way in which that has changed or not changed, and what that says about the nature of those commitments. But all of that to one side, the question that I do want to ask about is, and I think this is the best way to link what you were talking about to things that came up yesterday and actually today as well. I'm thinking particularly about the term tribe, and how that might get us to talking about the nature of commitments to cosmopolitan ideals. So you express some skepticism about the term. I share that skepticism, others have mentioned it, and you say specifically that you think the anxiety lurking behind the term tribalism has to do with concerns about the dissolving acid forces, here I'm quoting you, of the market and of consumer culture, and the question of whether any ethical bonds and obligations can survive that acid. And that seems right to me, but I think there's also another aspect of the term tribe that Roger was trying to get at and was identifying Sebastian Junger's talk and his book as a source for this, and I know that you had to teach yesterday, so I'll just summarize a couple of things that came up in that conversation as a way of posing the question. One is that the talk that Sebastian Junger gave yesterday, he gave a very concise definition of tribe, which is what happens to you happens to me. We're in the same tribe if what happens to you happens to me. And it struck me that there's a resonance, interesting and complex to think about, with what you said just now about Kant's refusal to give up on the ideal of world citizenship. And you quoted from the Metaphysics of Morals, I think, or cited it, in which you said that what Kant means by world citizenship is a sense of shared responsibility in that the injustice done in one part of the world would be seen to affect all others. So, and that was your gloss on Kant's conception of world citizenship. Second thing that came up in Junger's talk was about the something like the limit case of tribalism. For him, the limit case of tribalism is illustrated in the willingness to die for one's commitment. That's the we know we're in the same tribe if we're willing to sacrifice our life. And a third thing that came up is that he thinks these commitments are matters more of emotion than reason. And this also came up in Leon Botstein's remarks at the beginning. All of which leads to the question I want to ask, which is about, and I'm sure it will be familiar to you, but it will be interesting in this context perhaps, about the nature of our commitment to cosmopolitan ideals. Do they have to have that kind of emotional power? Do they have to have that, do they need to grip us in that way? And if so, and by which I mean ideals like equal dignity for all, or the free movement of all, or bodily autonomy for all, for not just for my tribe, not just for the people I feel closest to, but for all of humanity. Are my commitment, do we, in order for another cosmopolitanism to work, does it require that kind of passionate commitment? And if so, do international institutions, can they inspire that kind of commitment?
These are wonderful comments which bring together the discussions that I have missed yesterday with what I was trying to say this morning. And there's such richness in what you are, in what you have asked me. Let me just pick up a few points. And I'll begin with this last one about emotion and affect and attachment, which seems to be preoccupying many of us. Now, I would like to distinguish, or I distinguish in my own thinking, between institutions and associations and affiliations. One of the functions of institutions in social life is to be able to shore up the deficiencies that human interactions themselves on a face-to-face can create. So I think that it is, I believe one has to have a realistic enough moral and political psychology to know, and Arendt certainly had this, that even a phrase like the love of mankind is a euphemism. And for her, you know, when she was questioned about her love of the Jewish people, as many of you will know, she gave a very controversial answer. She says, I only love my friends. I don't love a people. But so what kind of emotional attachment can we expect of ideas and principles? At what level do they operate? I want to suggest to you that there is one value which is also an emotion, can be an emotion that one can talk about in cosmopolitan ethics, and that is respect. I mean, respect is a commitment. It requires a certain kind of behavior from me. It demands some kind of behavior from me. Now, do I need to emotionally identify with the one whom I respect? I think the answer can be attenuated, and that's why Arendt always tries to make a distinction between empathy and taking the standpoint of the other. I can respect an opponent, let's say, in a court of law, an adversarial position for the arguments they're presenting, without emotionally identifying with that individual. So, and in many institutions and associations, the schools, professional life, civic life, whatever, churches, synagogues, exhibitions, and so on, we require also that sense of respect and mutuality and reciprocity. So it is not just in tribes that reciprocity is exercised. There is maybe generalized reciprocity and more specific forms of reciprocity, but I feel that these are on a scala. They're not sharp contrasts, but they exist in various ways. And what I want to insist on in particular is a beautiful concept that is used often in the liberal ethical tradition, and that is expanding circles of sympathy, okay? And the idea of cosmopolitanism is about expanding circles, I would say, also of respect. And so in that sense, I believe it can have a kind of emotional valence as well. But I want to insist on this institutional dimension. Because when institutions begin to rot, and when they no longer can realize the ethical principles for which they have been instituted, it is individuals who start bearing the burden, and it is individuals whose lives begin to fray at the edges. So I think we have maybe a kind of, sometimes, we tend to emphasize maybe the face-to-face, the immediacy of action, and certainly this is part of the Arendtian tradition. But we should not forget also the larger institutional embediment within which good politics can unfold.
Thank you very much. I could follow up on that, but I'm going to restrain myself and open to the room, and if there are no hands, which is not true, I would ask a question again, but I will open to the room. I see someone right there. Yes, no, white. Yes, that person right there.
Hi, my name is Arav, and I go to Dalton High School. So I guess my question is, for me, I think I'm pretty confident that a lot of these international institutions have created some kind of value, whether it's like the ICC or the ICJ. But I guess my question is, how can we truly universalize these institutions if the enforcers of these policies are the ones who are always breaking the laws? So I think of like Kashmir or Iraq or Ukraine or Xinjiang and Tibet, and like the people whose job it is to enforce these institutions' authority are the ones who are constantly undermining the actual credibility of the institution. And I kind of wonder, can we realistically develop an international, like a group of international institutions that can actually create a universalized like international law in a multipolar geopolitical landscape? And if these institutions are not actually universal, are they really creating the value that we sought to like have them create in the first place? And I think of like the P5, for example, in that scenario. Like, does the UN truly create the value that we set out to do if the 5 most powerful countries whose job it is to enforce the UN policy are the ones who have the authority to also break the UN's policy? Thank you.
Right, a very good, very important question. Look, these institutions, obviously, not only are they not perfect, but these are also crucial moments right now when you mentioned the Security Council strike, which is obviously a remnant of the Cold War, right? Like many also multilateral treaties of that period. I teach a course on refugee rights at Columbia. The 1951 Convention on the on the Status of Refugees is definitely a Cold War text in some ways. Now, the question is, we need to have a robust enough understanding of what was attempted in order to be able to engage in the radical reform process. That's easier said than done. I completely agree with you in that respect. One route that I have chosen is, I have focused, and this is my next book, I've focused a lot on a critique of international law and institutions voiced by a number of legal scholars that describe themselves as third world approaches to international law, TWAIL. They're just becoming known, the best of them are known as Angie with a very important book. Now, if we read their writings and if we engage with them, we can begin also some peaceful reform processes. One of the big issues that comes up in reading this literature is the struggle right now over resources. The resources of land, the resources of water. For example, the way in which the Republic of China is buying so much natural resources in Africa in anticipation of scarcity and population growth, etc. So we can enter it that way. We can begin that. The more global question about the conflict between power and normativity, the right of the stronger, this is fundamental to human politics. I mean, yes, express the criticism as strongly as you can, as, Arendt cites, history it often seems to be written by the stronger, but our moral obligation is to side with the weaker.
Right there, blue, yes.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So it seems as though the pluralist politics and Arendt's cosmopolitan dreams, as Roger was describing them yesterday, have come to fruition in the reverse of how she envisioned it. She seems to have envisioned international institutions and World Federation and international law as a cosmopolitan system of managing the plurality of the several tribes of the world. When you describe the international relations inspired by Trumpism, premised on commercial transaction and the position of international institutions as an arena for superpower competition, the world and nations seem quite cosmopolitan. But in the sense that their cosmopolitanism is tribal, and that it's unconcerned with or ignorant to the plurality of the tribes amongst them. Do you think that in this way, this tribal cosmopolitanism has trended toward a world state, that soulless despotism, or that nations are headed there intentionally? And do you view cosmopolitanism negatively in this sense?
Well, obviously, I try to make differentiations. I try to make differentiations in my understanding of cosmopolitanism. I don't quite understand the term tribal cosmopolitanism unless it is the position that I described at the very start of the paper, which there is a tendency to reduce cosmopolitanism to the institutions of neoliberal economics. And I think this is inadequate. I don't think this is correct. And as I try to point out, by going back to the history of cosmopolitanism. In the history of cosmopolitanism, the principles are the idea of sovereign equality among republican polities that will be bound pacifically by international law. That is to say, there will be laws regulating war and peace. Now, what about the core of other institutions, of other international institutions, such as trade and commerce? One way in which Kant is being criticized in his understanding of cosmopolitanism is as if he has opened the door to a kind of European imperialism, okay? This critique has been voiced again and again. I don't believe it is, I don't believe it sticks to all of Kant's writings, and I don't want to get very scholarly wonky on you, but there is an evolution in his understanding of world society from the early 1780s to the later writings. But for me, the point about it is this. It is the idea of worldliness, or the idea of the world that Arendt also shares. Liberalism begins also, it's part, this idea of reaching out and creating a world together that is bound up with European imperialism, with colonization, etc. But to be aware of the complexity of this world dimension, and then are there criteria, I don't want to be too long-winded on this, are there criteria in a Kantian understanding of cosmopolitanism that could enable us to criticize institutions of neoliberal globalization? My answer to that question is yes, but I owe you the argument. I haven't been able to give it in this paper. I hope maybe, forthcoming, I'll be able to do something about it.
There was a patient person here.
Yes.
Thank you. I just want to thank you, before I get into my question, for coming here. It's been a pleasure and an honor to hear from you and learn from you. I have a somewhat ignorant question, but it's okay. I'm young and passionate. So when you were talking about tribalism under cosmopolitan values, I couldn't help but think about the United States and how there are a lot of local governments, we have the states, who are in many ways tribal, and they're ruled under a federal government. And some people would think that works and some people doesn't, but what I think it allows us to do is, so we have a president who has, a lot of power. The power is centralized in the president in many ways. And when we elect the president, that allows us to mobilize and do things as a country. And I'm wondering, I guess, what is your take on using this United States structure as a model for cosmopolitanism? Because I think it is dangerous. I think that we've seen in the past election how, I'm talking about with Trump, how one bad election can lead to a major abuse of power. This can be seen in, international affairs, where Trump ordered drone strikes on Iranian scientists, which I think is a crime against humanity. And I'm curious about your opinion on American democracy.
Can I just ask you, because we're short on time, just
Yes.
put a point and a question mark on it at the end.
What did you say?
If you can just summarize the question, we're short on time.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. Do you think that there's a better system for us electing, people calling the shots for an international federacy, and what would that look like?
Thank you. And Seyla, I would suggest we maybe take one more question so that you can answer both of them, and then we'll have to wrap up. There's a question over there.
Thank you both for this beautiful discussion. Professor Benhabib, in your work, Another Cosmopolitanism, you mentioned how all empirical studies of genocide and ethnic cleansing point to the paradox that it is often neighbors rather than distant strangers who massacre one another. So my question is, how are we to imagine a universal mankind when we're unable to recognize the humanness of our closest neighboring communities because of our own tribalism, and possibly not even call it tribalism, but rather a toxic, counterproductive form of patriotism, considering the ineffectiveness of international bodies compared to domestic practices?
And Seyla, I have to ask you to be relatively brief.
I think that to the second question, and I'll get to the first, I believe that Fintan O'Toole has actually given much better answers at this point than I could about how victims, how conflict emerges out of a sense of victimhood, but the competition of victimhood, etc. I think there is a lot there that explains, for example, instances like Bosnia-Herzegovina, etc. Is it quite applicable to the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is also a national conflict? I know I hear this question coming up, and what I'm going to propose is that I talk with some of you at lunch, that we sit together at a table and discuss, because I don't want to exploit the schedule. To come back to your question, and I would like to talk to you at length. Part of my anxiety are trends that have developed also in the US Supreme Court for the last 20 years that have made this country increasingly isolationist, that has made this country turn its own back upon the institutions and laws it has promulgated. I mean, I think Roger also knows the story very well. There is a story of American isolationism that begins with Justice Scalia. The Federalist Society, my old institution, Yale, caught like fire in the law school. And the most, I think, dangerous accomplishment of the Trump period was the appointing of hundreds of federal judges coming out of this isolationist, anti-human rights, anti-internationalist point of view. It is not the only thing that is going on. I'm not going to talk about the Electoral College or so, but it is one issue that I have been focusing on a little bit, is trying to understand how this began, because this is not the only American tradition. There is a tradition that sees itself as, beginning with Jefferson, the common opinion of mankind. That's what the law should conform to, right? So there's been a regressive moment in the last 20 or 30 years, and we probably will pay the price, even if the Democrats win the election, because these have been institutional transformations.
Before we thank Professor Benhabib again, I would like to let you know that the next panel, which will be starting immediately, I hope everyone will be able to stay. We will welcome Mandar Apt, Philip Rock Lester, Gilbert Johnson, and the discussant will be Nairobi Way. That panel is Bloods, Crips, and the Overcoming of Tribalism in Los Angeles. That will happen immediately now. And please join me in thanking Seyla Benhabib.